everybody. All right, lesson number 5 in fantasy. Here we go. All right, so today our focus is on how to read metaphorically. So as you recall, a metaphor is when an author takes one object to represent a different object. Today we're going to be looking at the metaphor of dragons, and dragons is oftentimes a metaphor for danger. And so back in the 1500s, when cartographers or map makers would make maps, they would actually write, "Here be dragons." And they would put actual dragons on maps. Now, the dragons did not signify that there was necessarily a dragon there, but rather danger. So the danger could be something very unknown. It could be there are earthquakes that are happening there, many different things, but the dragon was a metaphor for danger. Now, dragons in your stories, some of your fantasy stories are going to have actual dragons. And as you know, those of you who are reading those, some of the dragons are protagonists, the positive characters, some are antagonists, more of the negative characters. But a lot of you do not have dragons in your books. And those of you who don't have dragons in your books, I want you to think about what are the metaphorical dragons that your book has. So when you're thinking about the dragons, you're thinking about what trouble do your different characters experience? What conflicts are there? What are the character flaws? You know, everyone has strengths and everyone has weaknesses, and an interesting, complex character has a balance of both strength and weaknesses because that's more realistic, right? And so when we are reading, I want you to really think about what are Harvey's dragons as we're listening today, and as you are reading your books, what are the metaphorical dragons that your characters are experiencing? Even if they are an actual dragon, you can think about what are their struggles, what are their conflicts. Everyone has them. I would say one of my dragons right now when I film is to not say It is a challenge for me that I am trying to overcome. Now you will pay attention to it. I shouldn't have said that. Another dragon is when in quarantine it's hard to not just want to eat delicious food all the time. So that's one of the dragons that I face, and everyone faces different kind of dragons. The interesting thing about it is, how do people react when those dragons appear, right? How do they react to the challenge? And that tells a lot about people. And so as you are reading and listening, thinking about what are the metaphorical dragons in the books and in your life. Okay? All right, let's go.
Back. "What do I do?" Harvey said. "Do I flap or what?" "Jump," Jive said. "The wind'll take care of the rest. Either the wind or gravity." And with that, he shoved Harvey off the edge of the roof and into the empty air. Chapter 10. Falling from Grace. The wind wasn't there to bear him up. He plummeted like a slate tossed from the gables, a cry of sheer terror escaping his throat. He saw Wendell turn, saw a look of mortal fear come onto his face. Then the wind came out of nowhere, cold and strong, and just as his legs brushed the bushes, he felt himself lifted up and up toward the sky. His cry became a whoop, his terror joy. The moon was larger than he'd ever seen it, and its vast white face filled his sight, like the face of his mother, bending to kiss him goodnight. Except that he needed no sleep tonight, no, nor a mother to wish him sweet dreams. This was better than any dream, flying with the wind in his wings, and the world shuddering below in fear of his shadow. He looked for Wendell again, and saw him fleeing for the safety of the house. "No, you don't," he thought, and fuming his wings like leathery sails, he swooped down on his prey. A blood-curdling shriek filled his ears, and for a moment he thought it was the wind. Then he realized it was his own throat that was uttering this inhuman din. and the shriek became laughter, wild, lunatic laughter. "Don't, please, don't!" Wendell was sobbing as he ran. "Somebody help me! Somebody help me!" Harvey knew he'd already had his revenge. Wendell was frightened out of his wits. But it was too much fun to stop now. He liked the feel of the wind beneath him and the cold moon on his back. He liked the sharpness of his eyes and the strength of his claws. But most of all, he liked the fear he was causing, liked the look on Wendell's upturned face and the sound of panic in his chest. The wind was carrying him down into the thicket, and as he landed, Wendell dropped to his knees, begging for mercy. "Don't kill me, please, please, I beg you, don't kill me." Harvey had seen and heard enough. He'd had his revenge. It was time to put an end to the game before the fun soured. He opened his mouth to announce himself, but Wendell, seeing the red throat and the wolfish fangs, and thinking this meant certain death, began a new round of supplications. This time, however, he wasn't simply begging. "I'm too fat to eat," he said, "but there's another kid around here somewhere." Harvey growled at this. "There is," Wendell said. "I swear, and there's more meat on him than on me." "Listen to the child," said a voice in the bushes at Harvey's side. He glanced around. There was Jive, his wiry form barely visible among the barbs. "He'd see you dead, young Harvey." Wendell heard none of this. He was still advertising the edibility of his friend, hoisting up his shirt and shaking his blubbery belly to prove how unpalatable he was. "You don't want me," he sobbed. "Take Harvey! Take Harvey!" "Bite him," said Jive. "Go on, drink a little of his blood. Why not? The fat's no good, but the blood's hot. The blood's tasty." He was doing a little dance as he spoke, stamping his feet to the rhythm of his chant. "Don't waste the taste. Go eat the meat." And still Wendell whined, all snot and tears. "You don't want me. Find Harvey. Find Harvey." And the more he sobbed, the more Jive's chant made sense to Harvey. Who was this ridiculous boy Wendell anyway? He was too eager to serve Harvey up as dinner to be called a friend. He was just a tasty morsel. Any vampire worth his wings would chew off his head as soon as look at him. And yet... "What are you waiting for?" Jive wanted to know. "We've gone to all this trouble to make a monster of you." "Yes, but it's a game," Harvey said. "A game?" said Jive. "No, no, boy. It's more than that. It's an education." Harvey didn't know what he meant by this, and he wasn't altogether certain he wanted to know. "If you don't pounce soon," Jive hissed, "you're going to lose him." It was true. Wendell's tears were clearing, and he was staring at his attacker with a puzzled look. "Are you going to let me go?" he murmured. Harvey felt Jive's hand on his back. "Do it," Jive said. Harvey looked at Wendell's tear-stained face and trembling hands. If the situation had been reversed, he thought to himself, would I have been much braver? The answer, he knew, was no. "It's now or never," said Jive. "Then it's never," Harvey said. "Never!" The word came out as a guttural roar, and Wendell fled before it, yelling at the top of his voice. Harvey didn't give chase. "You disappoint me, boy," Jive said. "I thought you had the killer instinct." "Well, I don't," said Harvey, a little ashamed of himself. He felt like a coward, even though he knew he'd done the right thing. "That was a waste of magic," said another voice, and Mar appeared from out of the bushes, her arms filled with enormous fungi. "Where'd you find those?" Jive said. "Usual place," Mar replied. She gave Harvey a contemptuous look. "I suppose you want your old body back," she said. "Yes, please." "We should leave him like this," said Jive. "He'd get around to sucking blood sooner or later." "Nah," said Mar. "There's only so much magic to go around. You know that. Why waste it on a miserable little punk like this?" She waved her hand casually in Harvey's direction, and he felt the power that had filled his limbs and transformed his face drain out of him. It was a relief, of course, to feel the magic unmade, but a little part of him mourned the loss. In a matter of moments, he was once again an earthbound boy, wingless and weak. With the spell removed, Mar turned her back on him and waddled off into the darkness. Jive, however, lingered long enough to have one last dig at Harvey. "You missed your chance there, kiddo," he said. "You could have been one of the greats." "It was a trick, that's all," Harvey said, concealing the strange unhappiness he felt. "A Halloween trick. It meant nothing." "There are those who'd disagree," Jive said darkly. "Those who'd say that all the great powers in the world are blood-suckers and soul-stealers at heart, and we must serve them, all of us, serve them to our dying day." He stared hard at Harvey all the way through this peculiar little speech, and then, with a nimble step, retreated into the shadows and was gone. Harvey found Wendell in the kitchen, a hot dog in one hand and a cookie in the other, telling Mrs. Griffin about what he'd seen. He dropped his food when Harvey came in and yelped with relief. "You're alive! You're alive!" "Of course I'm alive," said Harvey. "Why shouldn't I be?" "There was something out there, a terrible beast. It almost ate me. I thought maybe it had eaten you." Harvey looked down at his hands and legs. "Nope," he said. "Not a nibble." "I'm glad," Wendell said. "I'm so, so glad. You're my best friend for always." "I was vampire food 5 minutes ago," Harvey thought, but he said nothing. Maybe there'd come a time when he could tell Wendell about his transformation and temptation, but this wasn't it. He simply said, "I'm hungry," and sat down at the table beside his fair-weather friend to put something sweeter than blood in his belly. Chapter 11. Turnabout. Neither Wendell nor Lulu was around the following day. Mrs. Griffin said she'd seen them both before breakfast, and then they disappeared. So Harvey was left to his own devices. He tried not to think about what had happened the night before, but he couldn't help himself. Snatches of conversation kept coming back, and he puzzled over them all day long. What had Jive meant, for instance, when he told Harvey that turning him into a vampire was not so much a game as an education? What kind of lesson had he learned by jumping off a roof and scaring Wendell? And all that stuff about soul stealers and how they had to be served. What had that meant? Was it Mr. Hood that Jive had been speaking of? That great power they all had to serve? If Hood was somewhere in the house, why hadn't anyone, Lulu, Wendell, or himself, encountered him? Harvey had quizzed his friends about Hood, and had the same story from them both. They'd heard no footfalls, no whispers, no laughter. If Mr. Hood was indeed here, where was he hiding, and why? So many questions, so few answers. And then, if these mysteries weren't enough, another came along to vex him. In the late afternoon, lounging in the shade of the treehouse, he heard a yell of frustration and peered through the leaves to see Wendell racing across the lawn. He was dressed in a windbreaker and boots, even though it was swelteringly hot, and he was stamping around like a madman. Harvey shouted to him, but his call went either unheard or ignored. So he climbed down and pursued Wendell around the side of the house. He found him in the orchard, red-faced and sweaty. "What's going on?" he said. "I can't get out," Wendell said, grinding a half-rotted apple underfoot. "I want to leave, Harvey, but there's no way out." "Of course there is." "I've been trying for hours and hours, and I tell you the mist keeps sending me back the way I came." "Hey, calm down." "I want to go home, Harvey," Wendell said, close to tears now. "Last night was too much for me. That thing came after my blood. I know you don't believe me." "I do," said Harvey. "Honest, I do." "You do?" "For sure." "Well, then maybe you should leave too, 'cause if I go, it'll come after you." "I don't think so," said Harvey. I've been kidding myself about this place, Wendell said. It's dangerous. Oh, yeah, I know it seems like everything's perfect, but... Harvey interrupted him. Maybe you should keep your voice down, he said. We should talk about this quietly, in private. Like where? Said Wendell, wild-eyed. The whole place is watching us and listening to us. Don't you feel it? Why would it do that? I don't know, Wendell snapped. But last night I thought, if I don't leave, I'm going to die here. I'll just disappear one night, or go crazy like Lulu. He dropped his voice to a whisper. We're not the first, you know. What about all the clothes upstairs? All the coats and shoes and hats? They belonged to kids like us. Harvey shuddered. Had he played trick-or-treat in a murdered boy's shoes? I want to get out of here, Wendell said, tears running down his face. But there's no way out. If there's a way in, there must be a way out, Harvey reasoned. We'll go to the wall. With that, he marched off, Wendell in tow, around to the front of the house and down the gentle slope of the lawn. The mist wall looked perfectly harmless as they approached it. Be careful, Wendell warned. It's got some tricks up its sleeve. Harvey slowed his step, expecting the wall to twitch or even to reach for him. But it did nothing. Bolder now, he strode into the mist, fully expecting to emerge on the other side. But by some trick or other, he was turned around without even being aware of it, and delivered out of the wall with the house in front of him. What happened? He said to himself. Puzzled, he stepped back into the mist. The same thing occurred. In he went, and out he came again, facing the opposite direction. He tried again, and again, and again, but the same trick was worked upon him every time, until Harvey was as frustrated as Wendell had been a half hour before. Now do you believe me? Wendell said. Yep. So what do we do? Well, we don't yell about it, Harvey whispered. We just get on with the day. Pretend we've given up leaving. I'm going to do a little looking around. He began his investigations as soon as they got back into the house, by going in search of Lulu. Her bedroom door was closed. He knocked, then called her. There was no reply, so he tried the handle. The door was unlocked. Lulu, he called. It's Harvey. She wasn't there, but he was relieved to see that her bed had been slept in, and that she'd apparently been playing with her pets recently. The doors to the doll's house were open, and the lizards were everywhere underfoot. There was one strangeness, however. The sound of running water led him through to the bathroom, where he found the bath full almost to brimming, and Lulu's clothes scattered in the puddles on the tile. Have you seen Lulu? He asked Mrs. Griffin when he got downstairs. Not in the last few hours, she replied, but she's been keeping to herself. Mrs. Griffin looked hard at Harvey. I wouldn't pay too much mind if I were you, child, she said. Mr. Hood doesn't like inquisitive guests. I was only wondering where she'd got to, Harvey said. Mrs. Griffin frowned, her tongue working against her pale cheek as though it wanted to speak, but didn't dare. Anyway, Harvey went on, deliberately goading Mrs. Griffin, I don't believe Mr. Hood exists. Now you be careful, she said, her voice and frown deepening. You don't want to talk about Mr. Hood that way. I've been here days and days, Harvey said, realizing as he spoke that he'd lost count of his time in the house. And I haven't seen him once. Where is he? Now Mrs. Griffin came at Harvey with her hands raised, and for a moment he thought she was going to strike him. But instead, she took hold of his shoulders and shook him. Please, child, she said, be content with what you know. You're here to enjoy yourself for a little time. And, child, it's such a little time. It flies by. Oh, Lord, how it flies. It's just a few weeks, Harvey said. I'm not going to stay here forever. Now it was he who stared at her. Or am I? He said. Stop, she told him. You think I am here forever, don't you? He said, shaking off her grip. What is this place, Mrs. Griffin? Is it some kind of prison? She shook her head. Don't tell me lies, he said. It's stupid. We're locked up in here, aren't we? Now, though she was shaking with fear from head to foot, she dared to make a tiny nod of her head. All of us? He asked. Again she nodded. You too? Yes, she whispered. Me too. And there's no way out. Believe me, if you try to escape again, Karna will come after you. Karna, he said, remembering the name from the conversation between Jive and Mar. He's up there, Mrs. Griffin said, on the roof. That's where the four of them live. Rictus, Mar, Karna, and Jive. You know. I've met them all but Karna. Pray you never do, said Mrs. Griffin. Now, listen to me, Harvey. I've seen many children come and go through this house, some of them foolish, some of them selfish, some sweet, some brave. But you are one of the brightest souls I have ever set eyes on. I want you to take what joy you can from being here. Use the hours well, because there'll be fewer than you think. Harvey listened patiently to this. Then, when she'd finished, he said, I still want to meet Mr. Hood. Mr. Hood is dead, Mrs. Griffin said, exasperated by his persistence. Dead? You swear? I swear, she replied. On the brave of my poor Clue Cat, I swear, Mr. Hood is dead. So don't ask about him ever again. This was the first time Mrs. Griffin had ever come close to giving Harvey an order, and though he wanted to press her further, he decided not to. Instead, he said he was sorry for bringing up the subject and wouldn't do it again, then left her to her secret sorrows.
Alright, so let's talk about some of the metaphorical dragons in The Thief of Always. So one of the metaphorical dragons that we've encountered recently for Harvey is his anger and his revenge. As you recall, he was pretty frustrated. Harvey was frustrated with Wendell on Halloween because he played a trick on him, right? And in order to get back, he got in with Jive and was turned into a vampire. And the whole idea was he was just going to scare Wendell. But Wendell did something kind of surprising. Let me read it. On page 95. Is it 95? I think so. Nope. Sorry, I should have written the page numbers down. It was on page 85, actually. Harvey knew he already had his revenge. Wendell was frightened out of his wits. But it was too much fun to stop now. He liked the feel of the wind beneath him and the cold moon on his back. He liked the sharpness of his eyes and the strength of his claws. But most of all, he liked the fear he was causing. He liked the look on Wendell's upturned face and the sound of panic in his chest. So this is definitely one of Harvey's dragons because, as we know, like taking advantage of people's fear isn't necessarily a admirable attribute to people. When Harvey just continues to scare Wendell, that is showing one of Harvey's weaknesses, and one of his weaknesses is his joy he's getting out of the revenge, right? Another time that Harvey has some dragons is this time it's actually on page 95, and it's when he realizes that he's trapped in a house at the Holiday House. He and Wendell are trying over and over again to get out. It's sad. He tried again and again and again, but the same trick was worked upon him every time until Harvey was frustrated as Wendell had been a half hour before. Now do you believe me? Wendell said. Yes. So what do we do? So then they go on. So one of Harvey's dragons is definitely the Holiday House and the spell that it has on him. And so that is the trouble and the obstacle he is facing. let's talk about Wendell, because Wendell has so many metaphorical dragons. One of them definitely appears on page 86, and it's his lack of loyalty. And loyalty is when you stand up for the people who you feel like have your back, right? And he clearly sold out Harvey when the vampire was coming towards him. So on page 86, it says, "You don't want me," he sobbed. "Take Harvey, take Harvey." And he goes on in his desperate plea to have the vampire eat Harvey instead of him. And so you can see that that would have come as a surprise to Harvey, right? Because as you will notice, Harvey is a very loyal person in this text. He's pretty admirable in terms of that. That's definitely not one of his dragons. I think Wendell actually is not loyal in this instance because he's kind of weak and he's kind of scared. I know that when people are very afraid, right, we do things that we wouldn't normally want to do. So that could be part of it. The last thing I want to talk about is on page 93. And on page 93, at this point, we're still talking about Wendell, and it says, so the problem is Wendell's problem-solving skills are pretty weak. He definitely doesn't have a lot of coping mechanisms. It says, "I can't get out," Wendell said, grinding a half-rotted apple underfoot. "I want to leave, Harvey, but there's no way out." "Of course there is. I've been trying for hours and hours, and I tell you the mist keeps sending me back the way I came." "Hey, calm down." "I want to go home, Harvey," Wendell said, close to tears now. "Last night was too much for me. That thing came after my blood." "I know you don't believe me." "Oh, I do," said Harvey. "Honest, I do." "You do?" "Certainly." So we can see some of Wendell's dragons as well, right? His weaknesses, his lack of loyalty, and his lack of problem-solving skills, which is why we should think deeply and be paying attention to our schoolwork, because we don't want to be weak-minded like Wendell, okay? All right, so as you are reading, I want you to pay attention to what are the flaws, what are the problems in the story, and what are the metaphorical dragons. All right, I hope you are well. I look forward to talking about it with you soon. Bye-bye.